Ida B's table here in Baltimore City. We are here this evening at the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle's primary election night watch party, where we're going to be counting down the results and taking a look at how the campaigns have worked out for candidates here in Baltimore and across the state of Maryland. We're going to be checking out whether or not progressives are going to have a big win tonight. Right now, we already have Ben Jealous, who's up in his race for governor, and we also see Senator Jill Carter in the 41st Legislative District up in her race. This evening, we're going to have a series of panels of experts who are coming to you from here inside of Ida B's table, and also we'll be going to Easy Jackson, who will be checking in with the pulse of this room and getting reactions as the results unfold. So I'm going to go to Easy Jackson right now, and stay with us for the night. It's going to be a good time.
Good evening. We are live in Ida B's table at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. It's a black think tank here in Baltimore. They are hosting a watch party, and we're here just to talk to folks, find out, what's on people's minds as these election results come in. I'll be interviewing folks in the room, some folks here doing some really important work in Baltimore and in Maryland. So stay tuned. We're going to keep you updated. Right now, the energy in the room is really good. People are coming together, talking. A lot of good people in the room. The election results are up. Ben Jealous is up in the polls. Marilyn Mosby is up in the polls. Ben Jealous, of course, one of the Democratic candidates for governor here in Maryland. Marilyn Mosby, the current state's attorney seeking re-election, right now leading in massive numbers. I think over 12,000 votes so far she's gotten, compared to about 5 for Ivan Bates. So we're keeping an eye on those as they come in, and we'll continue to talk to folks throughout the night. One of the things you should know, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle is not hosting this with The Real News. We are broadcasting live here separately, but we want to keep you posted, and we'll be going back to Khalilah.
All right, welcome back. So I'm joined right now by Mark Steiner, host of The Mark Steiner Show, now on the Real News Network.
You're here.
Brother Davon Love, who is the Director of Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. What we've heard tonight is we have a situation where 3 polling booths in Baltimore City have had to be extended because there were some anomalies this morning. We have Patapsco Elementary School, where apparently there were mice and fleas reported, so they had to shut that site down. Baltimore IT Academy also opened 2 hours late. Some of the polling booths were not there. So other than that, the biggest thing that happened is 80,000 people's voter registration were not transferred were not transferred from MVA to the Board of Elections. So we had a bunch of people, some of whom may be being disenfranchised today, who had to either complete a provisional ballot or might have decided not to come to the polls. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
But if they voted, they have to count those ballots.
Right. But not until July 5th, right?
Pardon?
Not until July 5th.
Not until July, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So if it's a close race, like if those races are within a margin of error, then they have to wait till July 6th to say who won those races.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things we got to really keep in mind, if you look around the world and you look at how democracies are destabilized in order to keep certain elements of the status quo in place, I think it's not hyperbole to use that analogy in the context of Baltimore City. I mean, when we think about the fact that, there's a Democratic Party establishment that folks have heard me talk about consistently, about the way in which it maintains racism and white supremacy in Baltimore and the state of Maryland, in my own experience in terms of advocacy in Annapolis, this kind of different disenfranchisement is important because it shows us the ways in which democracy is undermined when the status quo wants to maintain its power.
Well, it's also, I think, for some reason, the voting system in the state of Maryland has always been like this. There's always been these glitches that have taken place in almost every election that I've covered over the years.
Yeah.
And I think that and it's happening again. And part of it has to do with the administration.
Yeah.
And they're not always just ready for prime time when it comes to this, And the sad part about it is if that forces people not to vote, that becomes real disenfranchisement.
That's right.
Of a vote.
That's right. But we have some elected officials who are calling for the resignation of the head of the Maryland Board of Elections.
Right.
So we'll see how that goes. You both are actively involved in the legislative session. Every spring, we know it's the first 90 days of the year beginning in January. Davon, you are regularly down in Annapolis on behalf of the people of Baltimore.
They're about to name a hall after him.
They're going to name a hall after you, Davon. And also, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Adam's going to talk about this in a few, but Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle issued a report card this year on the legislative session. Will you talk a little bit about that and how you got to that point?
Yeah, one of the things that, so this was like my sixth session in Annapolis consistently. And one of the things that I recognized was a part of the effectiveness of the work that we were doing in Annapolis was merely our ability to expose what was happening in Annapolis. A lot of legislators kind of bank on the fact that people aren't going to know what they do. So they can come back to the community, say, yeah, we stood up for you, we did what was right, but go down to Annapolis and follow leadership. And so the report card was our attempt to put in writing the things that we know intuitively based on our advocacy and make it public, make it available to the public so the public can make their own informed decisions about what their legislators are actually doing. Because again, legislators aren't going to tell you. They're going to tell you the version of themselves they want you to know. So we wanted to provide a version of legislators as we saw them.
And so, Mark, you normally do a kickoff to the legislative session on the Mark Steiner Show. Yeah. Tell us about the summit and what kind of things you heard at the beginning of session and kind of how you saw it unfold.
I mean, one of the most important aspects of that, in terms of this election we're in now, is that there are a lot of progressive candidates who are running in this particular election in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and I think that I'm really anxious to see how this turns out. I mean, there are people who are challenging the established voices in Annapolis, in Baltimore. Will they prevail? And some of the people who are running, like Cory McRae, Antonio Hayes, Mary Washington, Joe Carter, they're really pushing the envelope in this election.
Right.
I mean, their voices in Annapolis, as progressive voices, as voices that are not going to be in the status quo, are really critical.
Right.
It's happening in Baltimore County, where Sheldon Glaskin's taking on Bobby Zirkin.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen in that race, but Sheldon decided to run a very serious campaign, and he's challenging Bobby Zirkin, win or lose. This is the basis of something brand new happening in the state.
That's right.
So that to me is the most. I'm really excited to watch what happens. Win or lose, this is building a new movement, I think.
Yeah, I think we saw people who profess to be progressives doing some things this session that made voters, I think, take a pause, especially when it comes to criminal justice and mandatory minimums, something that you guys advocated on. Will you talk a little bit about the bill that unfolded and kind of how it shook out towards the end?
So one of the things that tends to happen, particularly when there are high homicide rates in Baltimore City, is that black people become the basis of the kinds of racist attacks that legislators put on black folks. And that usually happens through criminal justice, through this crime bill that was put forward by Senator Bobby Zirkin, who kind of in his own mind with his own collection of people decided to develop this so-called comprehensive crime bill in 2018. And one of the things that was frustrating dealing with Bobby Zirkin, and it's the tactic that many liberals use now, where they use progressive rhetoric, but the substance of their policies are still regressive. And so while Bobby and Senator Zirkin in the legislation included funding for things like Safe Streets, that was in order to get mandatory minimums, an increase from 5 years to 10 years on mandatory minimums, second-time gun offenders, and would use the kind of rhetoric that criminalizes and pathologizes black people in ways that undermine the quality of life of black people. It is the rhetoric that justifies the war on drugs and produces the policies that undermine our humanity. So, I think it goes to show that the co-optation of kind of radical progressive calls for reform to criminal justice and that co-optation in the instance of Bobby Zirkin is an attempt to try to stave off progressive challenges in order to maintain power.
Right, and I think, and also the issue got very confused. And you were down there all the time around this bill. And the bill reminded me of what happened in the Clinton administration with the omnibus crime bill that was pushed through, right? That began, but really pushed ahead the mass incarceration of people in this country, and of black people in this country, people of color in this country. There's a real danger in what just happened, because they were also able to get people who were honestly frightened about crime in their communities and turn that around to create a bill that's going to incarcerate a lot of people that should not be incarcerated in the name of safety. And I think, and look at the Baltimore delegation. It was really, the numbers of people who ended up voting for that bill was a political fear tactic. And I think that's a real danger. That's why who wins in this election is going to be really critical to what happens in these next sessions coming up.
Right. And we saw, in the 46th legislative district, you have Team 46, who professes themselves also to be as progressives that people can count on, yet I think they all voted for this particular bill. And so you find people who are trying to find the balance between progressivism and in some ways maintaining the order in Annapolis. And I think this election is really going to cause us to see whether or not the people agree with those strategies. And even if some people get elected who might have fallen on the wrong side, I think you have an electorate that is fired up about a lot of these issues in a way they hadn't been before.
And the problem is, in that district you just talked about, Robin Lewis voted for the bill. She's really progressive on a lot of issues. She's actually a pretty good human being, I think. But what the person opposing her is like, he's using crime as a way to get white voters upset so he can win and unseat her. And so and part of it is, I think part of it is that there's not a political movement in this community, in the city, in the state, that they have to answer to. That's part of the problem.
Well, I think the 46 is probably a little different than some of the other legislative districts. It is it's about 50-50 white, black. You have some of the most affluent people living on one side of the harbor, some people who have been in under-resourced communities for decades on the other side of the harbor. And then you have someone who, frankly, moved into the district and decided to run who's not from the community, challenging people who have been activists in the community for a very long time, particularly Robin Lewis. You also have some people who take issue with the positioning of Nate Lowenthal versus Robin Lewis, when there are three people running for delegate and no seat is promised. And so there was also that dynamic of, I'm going to position myself against this black woman and say that there's an open seat as opposed to challenging Luke Clippinger or Brooke Learman.
Yeah, so two things. Using the crime bill as an example, there was and I forget what date it was, the Daily Record, where the CEO of Chesapeake Industries, Maryland, made a comment about her employees feeling unsafe. And when you think about the GBC, right, the Center of White Corporate Power in Baltimore City, they were heavily behind the passage of this crime bill. So in the context of District 46, you see a lot of those same forces at play, right? You have, like you mentioned, your GBC types, right? The folks that really they just want black people to go away, right? And what you have is you have the politicking of the kind of mandatory minimums in a way that isn't really about the people that are suffering as a result of it. One thing, a distinction I think is important. On the Senate side, the crime bill was Zirkin's bill. What happened on the House side was slightly different. It is something that's actually reflected in our report card. Because a part of what happened, the Legislative Black Caucus took a vote to reject Senate Bill 122, which was a very strong thing for the Legislative Black Caucus to do. What the leadership, the Democratic Party leadership did is that on those last days, they had meetings, right, with the Black Caucus trying to get them to change their vote. And what they came up with, certain members of the Black Caucus, what they came up with was Senate Bill 101, which was sponsored initially by the late Senator Norman. It was an expungement bill that they amended onto it to particular mandatory minimums that they really wanted, and shoved it down the throats of the House of Delegates, doing 2 sessions in a day to get it off the floor on a Saturday before session's over. So one of the things we reflected on our report card, we actually penalized Senator Ferguson more than we penalized the other legislators in the House of Delegates, because he voted for the straight-up comprehensive crime bill. Whereas we understood, and what was included in SB 101 was expungement, right, of certain nonviolent felonies.
Right.
So for us, even though we disagree with the approach, one could reasonably argue that the expungement was an exchange for those mandatory minimums, right? So I just think that's an important fine distinction that it helps put in context the race in District 46.
And some people would say that there weren't any mandatory minimums in that bill because they were actually adding on time to people who already had minimums.
So that's the tricky part about it. And Senator Zirkin, in terms of crafty rhetoric, they increased mandatory minimums for second-time gun offenses from 5 years to 10 years, but made 5 of it suspendable. There's a lot of legal gymnastics one could do to say it's not technically an increase because you're making 5 of it suspendable. But the argument is that most people do at least half of that suspended part of the sentence. So regardless of what one says technically, what happens in practice is an increase in time that people will spend incarcerated.
And again, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier, at least from my perspective, is that's why it's so important to organize a political movement in the city and coalitions in the city that people have to answer to. And so right now they think all I have to answer to is political establishment. All I have to answer to is Senator Miller. That's all I have to do to the President of the Senate. When we need to have the power that people have to answer to. That's when it changes.
Yeah.
That's why some of these elections in this tonight will be so critical in kind of at least seeing where that power can go.
Right. I mean, speaking of changes that's going to happen tonight, we have almost 50% of the Democratic Central Committee turning over. We have a number of people who have no idea what the Democratic Central Committee is, and during this campaign season saw people running grassroots elections or campaigns for Democratic Central Committee in a way that they hadn't seen before, which flagged for people, hey, we vote these people in who can decide, like in the case of Nathaniel Oates.
Who takes over.
Right. Whereas before, it was kind of, the establishment decides, the senator decides what the Democratic Central Committee people will do in the voting room. Voting is public amongst them, so you don't exercise your own franchise as a member of the Central Committee, even though you're elected to represent citizens. And you see people running now who are very progressive in terms of their activism and politics, and it's going to make a difference in a few of these districts because if anything changes, if anyone steps down, which I want to shift us to, if anyone steps down, the Central Committee is going to make decisions about who takes over.
Right.
And then, the question is, are they going to have people in place who kind of do what the person stepping down would like them to do, or are they going to have people in place who exercise independent thought? Which gets me to the 43rd Legislative District. We have...
Which district, I'm sorry?
43rd.
Yeah.
We have Delegate Kurt Anderson, who, for all intents and purposes, didn't campaign this season, but is still on the ballot. And he faced accusations in accordance with the Me Too movement of sexual assault from not 1 or 2 or 3, but 5 different people. Folk knew about it before session ended. There was a little debacle at the end of the session where he tried to step down from being chair of the Baltimore City delegation. You had a few folk like Mary Washington who didn't allow the rules to be set aside unless he was willing to resign from his role, as opposed to using the rules to kind of maneuver getting out and saving face. This legislative session, we saw some legislation pass around Me Too. We saw several accusations come up with people wanting to have the legislature see them and hold people responsible for whether it be assault or extremely inappropriate behavior that I think citizens have a right to know whether or not elected officials are behaving in a way that represents them.
I mean, there's been that particular issue in Annapolis has been around for as long as I've been going back and forth to Annapolis.
Yeah.
And it's now just bubbling to the surface.
Yeah.
It's really deep. I mean, to be a woman, walk in those halls, and to put up with the kind of subtle harassment that goes on every day. Just men doing this and looking and saying something really off color.
Yeah, I've been there when when you approach someone and they say, "Oh, you look good today."
Yeah.
It's like, sir, Thank you.
Right, I'm not here for that.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
So about my bill.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I'm here to talk about education.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, it's
All
been
right.
around for a long time. You know, one of the accusers of Delegate Anderson, I think the incident happened 12 years ago or 14 years, something like that, and was reported then, and she felt like no one would listen. You know, there was no Me Too movement then. We also had a situation where a sister who's an advocate accused Delegate McCrae of inappropriate behavior along the lines of aggression and not in accordance with Me Too, but still wanting accountability for how people who hold power and are representing the general public behave when they're behind closed doors.
Yeah, I think so. Two things. One, it really bothers me the extent to which, like, I've heard stories that I can never repeat because the people who experience them don't want to come out and talk about it because of the vitriol that they'll receive if they come out and talk about it. And that to me is the really frustrating thing about all this, right? Is that, you know, people will say and profess to care about it, but when it's time to actually stand up and hold people accountable whom you may like and respect. And it seems to me that in many cases, people are more interested
preserving the order
and preserving people who they feel are good people in the seat.
Right.
And to me, the short-term benefit of that is outweighed by the long-term problem of certain kinds of behavior being excluded. And this is coming from a person that holds himself, I hold myself to a very high standard. And I hold the people around me to a very high standard. And we should not shy away from that. That people should have, if someone says that you did something, right, you should have to answer for it. And that doesn't mean that just because someone accuses you means you're guilty. Right. It just means that you should be held accountable, and it's okay.
And that's why I kind of distinguish the situation of Corey McCrae from Delegate Anderson, right? Because for all intents and purposes, you know, my experience with him is that he's a good guy. Does that mean you don't answer for this particular incident that did happen?
Right.
No. But what it also does, when you have an ethos where everything is hushed and set to the side, it's hard to move forward in a situation that is redeemable when you have people who are being protected who need to be gone.
Right.
You know?
Right.
I mean, the leadership in the House and Senate, the political leadership in this state, has been around a long time. When we talk about an old boys network, I mean, that network is just entrenched, and they're not going anywhere.
Right.
Not tomorrow morning. That's why a movement has to be built to make that change. You have to have a different man or woman sitting in the state house. You have to have different people pushing for leadership in the House and the Senate to make those things change. People do not get it.
That's right.
And I think the other part, though, and just speaking like as a black person, that my primary advocacy is about black people, like, we just have to do better.
We have to do better.
We just have to do better. And that doesn't mean that we're acutely worse in these kind of things, but I'm just, in terms of like responsibility on these kinds of issues, like, we have to create an environment where accountability can happen. We have to create an environment where people expect that they will have to answer for it. So with the situation with the sister and Delegate McCrae, for me, the question isn't so much, you know, should people like him or dislike him?
No.
The question is there an infrastructure or even just an expectation that he should have to speak about it in public and be held accountable for it, and people can decide to feel how they feel. Right. But the problem for me is even bringing it up. It's like, that's political.
Right.
You're
doing something. You're doing something to him. It's like,
you know what I mean?
No, actually, I hope the brother wins because he's good for us.
Right.
And I also interact with him in a way that lets me know he's a good brother. And we all make mistakes. So how do we hold one another accountable, right? Otherwise, there is no accountability. Right. I want to break away just for a quick minute, report out on some numbers. We have Ben Jealous now at 38.9%, Baker at 29.7%. We have in the state's attorney's race, Marilyn Mosby has 51% of the vote, trailed far behind by Ivan Bates at 30%. In the 41st, we have Senator Jill Carter at 57.1% of the vote, J.D. Merrill at 36.6%.
See that woman? Jill's behind?
No, she has 57.1%.
I didn't hear right. I'm sorry.
J.D. Merrill has 36.6.
Right.
Also, we see out in Baltimore County, delegate, no, this is not Baltimore County. This is also the 41st. Candidate Attar has 18%, Rosenberg 17%, Bilal Ali 11%, Bridges 11%, and Gibson 11%. So it's a pretty tight race for the third seat, but right now it's looking like Dahlia Attar and Sandy Rosenberg are in a dead heat at 18 and 17%. So, again, the question tonight is going to be whether or not progressives can prevail in this election, whether or not a new order is going to take place. By the way, if you are following us live, we are taking a look at the hashtag TRNN elections. If you want to give us some feedback or kick us some questions, we'll be taking your questions online, also on Facebook Live in our comments. So again, hashtag TRNN elections. If you want to tweet at me, if I say something that makes you grumpy, I'm at Ed to be free. Or you can tweet at The Real News, and the handle is at The Real News. So I want to go back to you guys, and then we're going to pitch to the state's attorney's race. What other things should we be looking for as the results come in this evening?
I mean, in the specific races?
Sure.
I mean, I think that I'm really, there's a lot of races I'm watching.
Yeah.
I'm going to watch what's happening with Mary Washington's race and Senator Conway. That's a really huge race.
Right.
We said McCrae's race, Antonio Hayes, and Robinson's race.
Mm-hmm.
That's a race that we have to watch. I mean, Hayes is part of the political world of Corey McCrae's the same club, kind of a very progressive pro-labor organization, that's a very critical piece. I'm really curious in Baltimore County to see what Sheldon does, Sheldon Laskin and Bobby Zirkin, how close he comes.
Yep.
Could it be an upset? Who knows that?
Yeah.
But also it's interesting for me, you said the Central Committee races.
Mm-hmm.
Also in Baltimore County, for the first time, there are the races for the Board of Education.
That's right.
People like Tara Huffman are running for Board of Education
School
and
board.
other people. So to me, watching these races, Nicole Mundell running for the State Central Committee here, out for Justice, and other people like that, and this is kind of beginning of a new political force of younger, powerful voices, many of them black voices, this is their beginning. They take these races, it could begin to change in 4 to 8 years, even more.
Right.
So I mean, I think watching all that take place, they may not be the races that are highlighted,
Right.
but I think they're really
How
critical.
these things come together. Yeah, just a few more results in. In the 43rd, you have a statistical dead heat between Conway at 49.9%, Mary Washington with 50%. In the delegate side, we have Maggie McIntosh at 25%. She's by far number one, but in second place, we have Kurt Anderson, who's at the top of the ticket, did no campaigning, but here he is with 18.7%, followed by Regina Boyce, 17.2%, and Kelly Fox at 11.8%. The 45th, Corey McCrae, 61.6%, and Nathaniel McFadden, 38.4%. So earlier today, we had TRN reporters talking with folk in the field at the polling stations about the state's attorney's race. And so why don't we take a second and take a look at some of the feedback we got from the community on the state's attorney's office race. Go ahead, tell me who you would vote for or why.
Marilyn Mosby, because she stood up for our black men when they were being killed or shot, some for no reason at all, and trying to press charges and get something fixed. They gave her a hard way to go for throwing them in jail, and that's that, it's wrong. We have,
I think Through was pretty incredible. Basing that solely on the fact that, he questioned Bates a little bit on, his record, and the response by Bates was a little bit off-putting. So him trying to sue the other people was not very thrilling, but yeah.
When you were looking at candidates, did you hear any of them that had a plan that really spoke to you to improve education in Baltimore?
Well, not really. I hear the same old rhetoric, so I'm just hoping that somebody have a heart and can get down and do the things that they're supposed to do.
Great to hear from people in the community. The state's attorney's office race is really critical. There's a heated race, but right now we see so far Marilyn Mosby is leading the pack. I want to kick it to Easy Jackson out in the restaurant, and he's going to get some more insights from some of our guests here. So let's go to Easy.
Thanks, Khalilah. We are again live here at Ida B's table. We got a young man here named Rajon Hall. He's a junior at Benjamin Franklin High School. How you doing, Rajon?
I'm doing great.
So they tell me that you've been doing some great work around climate change. Tell me a little bit about that. No, not. Am I wrong about that? What's the work you've been doing?
So at my school, we're basically working with 3 organizations: United Workers, Free Your Voice, and Towson. And what we've been working on is the issues around my school, around Curtis Bay. And my group was basically working on vacant housing, and we learned a lot. It was a great experience. What we learned was that there's over 5,000 vacant homes just around Curtis Bay alone. Many of the owners around the houses don't even live in the state or the city. So what we were trying to do is get funding from the city so we can take control and try to help the community around my school and basically fix the housing up and put people back in there.
Now that's really important. I think a lot of times when these elections come around, that's one of the things that come up. Why there's so many vacant houses. With all the leadership that we've had over the years in the city, these houses are still vacant. What was it that made you all take this on as a project?
Well, doing the research, we saw the impact. It was a big impact. It caused violence, crime rate, all that type stuff. So decreasing the vacant homes, you would also decrease other situations around. So, us doing research, we were actually leaving school, walking around the neighborhood, finding these homes, calling up the owners and asking them are you going to do anything or do you know about it? And many of them didn't. Many of them didn't know that they actually owned the house or so, because it was basically they were getting passed down by generations. So their great-grandfather could have bought the home and passed it down to them, and they had no idea.
So these properties are just sitting in people's families and nothing being done with them at all?
Yes, many of them.
So as far as this election is concerned, is there any of these races that stick out to you that you're paying attention to that might impact the work that you're doing?
Not really. How I see it is whoever wins, I just want to do a big cause for the city.
Okay. Well, appreciate all the work you're doing, man. Hang in there. You'll be old enough to vote soon, so make sure you do that. All right. Rajon Hall, Benjamin Franklin High School, doing awesome work there. Back to you, Khalilah.
All right, welcome back. I have some amazing guests here with me now. This is what's going to happen this evening. It gets more and more awesome as we go. We have Karen York, who's Executive Director of the Job Opportunities Task Force. And we have Eddie Conway, who's an Executive Producer at the Real News Network. So welcome, you guys.
Thank you.
A lot of excitement in here.
It's a lot of excitement, as it should be.
As it should be. We just reported before we went out that in the 41st Legislative, Joe Carter's at 57%, with J.D. Merrill at 36.6%. Conway and Washington in the 43rd are statistical dead heat. Corey McCray is walloping his competition with a 61.6% lead at this time. And we know that can change overnight as the results come in. You both do a ton of work related to both returning citizens, labor and the workforce. And, what's critical for your work, I think, is for people to be clear that the type of advocacy that you do or that you cover in Annapolis is created for everyday people to be able to live their best lives, right? No matter what their circumstances. Karen, why don't I check in with you first? You have been advocating for some critical bills this legislative session. What did you accomplish, and what do you hope to see after this election?
Sure. So this past legislative session in Annapolis, we found that there were a number of issues that came to the forefront. One, because they were necessary, but two, because it was an election year. And you find that the legislative session before the primaries during an election year, you're either going to have very bold ideas and policy initiatives that legislators want to get behind and kind of, stake a position on, or they're going to retreat and not want to do anything to ruffle feathers too much to ensure that they are reelected. And so this legislative session for the Job Opportunities Task Force, our focus has always been to identify ways to advance low-wage workers to high-wage jobs. We see, particularly in the city of Baltimore, that those communities that are more likely to suffer with challenges that result from unemployment and disinvestment, and we're talking about decades of disinvestment that leads to concentrated poverty, we're very clear that when it comes to advancing low-wage workers to high-wage jobs, we have to remove barriers. And many of these barriers are erected from, yes, decades of disinvestments, but also from criminal justice policies that leave individuals with a criminal record that makes them effectively unemployable. And so this legislative session, the Job Opportunities Task Force and partners focused on initiatives that would assure or eliminate those educational and employment barriers for individuals that have been incarcerated or interact with the criminal justice system to access economic opportunities. We are clear that in order to address our public safety challenges in the city of Baltimore, we have to provide access to economic opportunities. And so, when we talk about things like access to pretrial services, when we talk about this crime bill that was one of the top hot issues of the legislative session, right? We want to reduce incarceration and increase opportunities for economic opportunity and access, not increase opportunities for individuals to remain incarcerated. And so our legislative wins, while the crime bill did pass, we were able to beat back some of the more harsher mandatory minimums. Some slid through, in addition to some crazy felony expungement legislation that should have been more comprehensive. But we were able to secure $1 million in pretrial services. We were able to ensure that our punitive child support enforcement laws provided more opportunities for individuals to be in position to support their families. So there's more to be done, but it was an election year. Couldn't expect too much.
Right. And speaking of, opportunities over time, we just heard from Rajan, who's from South Baltimore, when he was talking with Easy Jackson. And, our young people are looking to build opportunity and not be criminalized because they're poor. And you released a report with the Job Opportunities Task Force this legislative session about the criminalization of poverty.
Yeah, criminalization of poverty, for most in the city of Baltimore, this ain't anything new, right? This is something that, we talk about all the time, but for our policymakers and others, it's now this new phenomenon. And for Job Opportunities Task Force, we started this this focus on criminalization of poverty, quite honestly, after the uprising. When we found that the world began to watch as community residents took to the street and found that, our communities are over-policed and underserved, and we were literally criminalizing our poor. We were criminalizing individuals who didn't have the money to make bail. We're criminalizing individuals who live in communities where there aren't banks, so they're cashing checks at check cashing place, walking through communities, and because they can't prove their money is innocent, their money is being seized and they have a chance to be arrested. All of these different things to show that Maryland policies, Maryland, our beautiful democratic state of Maryland, we are criminalizing our poor, who disproportionately tend to be people of color.
Right. It's like you can't win for losing. If I get in trouble or if I'm suspected of getting in trouble, the system is going to cause me to lose my job. It's going to cause me to have to pay fees and fines, or I can't get out of jail to keep the job when I didn't do anything to begin with. So it's just stacks on top of each other.
Absolutely.
Eddie, you have been covering the Poor People's Campaign for The Real News for the last 6 weeks. Will you talk a little bit about what you were seeing this session and what was important to people in Annapolis connected to the national movement around the Poor People's Campaign?
Well, the first thing that I think is important is that we need to be looking at systemic policy changes.
Right.
Before I talk about the campaign itself, the governor, Hogan, say, for instance, he's done committed $500 million to renovating, tearing down, just replacing the housing stock here in Baltimore. And what I noticed is that county companies are getting those jobs.
Right.
Other people than the residents are getting those jobs. You see huge construction projects occurring, and down on the next corner you see 20, 30, 40 young men, women standing around, can't find employment. It seems to me that much of that deconstruction should be directed toward employing some of young people. You don't have to have a professional skill set to take down a building, to take apart bricks, etc. Right? It seems to me that the city and the state could address some of that poverty that we see by employing those people that live in this particular district, in this municipality, and using that fund that the governor had set up that continues to go out into the county, they're taking the materials out there, they're taking the funds out there, and they're leaving the population in an unemployed state in which they are being, as you say, they're being criminalized. This is a state and city policy that the politicians need to address.
Absolutely.
So now, down in Annapolis for the last 6 weeks, people have been coming together, preachers, imams, rabbis, professional organizers, poor people, activists, environmentalists, and they've been demonstrating and actually doing civil disobedience in some cases and getting locked up. Even though Annapolis was closed since April, the national strategy was to protest in front of all the state houses because 2/3 of the state houses are still open and active. And so eventually that led to a major march in D.C. Just this past Saturday, in which several thousand people showed up from around the country. And their position is the same position, unfortunately, that Dr. Martin Luther King had 50 years ago, that there are several evils in the way this society is structured. One is racism, one is economic, capitalism for the want of a better word, but the economic arrangement, and the other one is militarism. The more money goes toward taking care of the military than it does taking care of the population. So I think that campaign is getting ready to start. It's going to be launched. That was the launch point Saturday. They're going to have to dig down and figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to address these issues. But the idea is the shift that discretionary budget funds, well over 50% of it, that goes to supplying the military toward dealing with poverty, dealing with infrastructure, dealing with education, dealing with health care, dealing with the environment, and so on. So unfortunately, I look at things on that level because that's the level it's got to change on in order for anything to happen.
Absolutely.
Because what's happening here in Baltimore and what's happening here in Maryland is happening in Detroit, it's happening in Newark, it's happening in Pennsylvania, and it's happening across Gary, Indiana.
That's right. Let me check in here. Thank you both. Let me check in here on some updates on the races. We have the Baltimore County executives. It looks like we're in a statistical dead heat. Each of them have somewhere between 33 and 34%. So that's Brochin, Allman, and Olszewski. In the gubernatorial election, Ben Jealous is maintaining a lead. He's at 38.9%. Baker's at 30%. Shea, 8.5%. Vignaraja, 7%. And Madaleno, 5%. In the 41st Jill P. Carter, excuse me, is at 57%. J.D. Merrill is at 36.3%. 43rd Legislative District, Senator Conway is at 49.2%. Mary Washington at 50.8%. In the state's attorney's race, we still have Marilyn Mosby at 51%, with Ivan Bates trailing most closely at 30%. And in New York, we have some big news. Socialist Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just won over the establishment candidate Crowley. And listen, that is a huge race in New York. And, you know, if it tells us anything, it sounds like we have progressives who are really pounding home on the people, right? And really putting forth socialist policy, or policy, frankly, that is just about progress for the people, by the people, and not progress for people who are staying in office. What are some of the races that you guys have been watching closely?
So, just to start off with, in my official capacity as Executive Director of the Job Opportunities Task Force of 501c3, we do not endorse candidates. We don't follow races.
I want to know your opinion. My sister friend Karen York.
Okay. Before I even get into that, I want to make a Karen York comment regarding the term progressive. I'm actually going to roll with your latter comment regarding supporting those policies. That's about progress for, of the people, by the people.
I often ask people, progress for who? Who are you talking about?
Right.
You mean my people?
And the reason why that's so important, because right now we hear everybody that want to use the term progressive.
Right.
I hate the term progressive.
Been in office 30 years.
What I mean?
I'm a progressive.
But even the newbies want to use progressive, because that, for some reason, progressive is supposed to be synonymous with, I get it, I'm going to champion worker issues. I get social justice and economic justice and criminal justice. And it's really just been exploited and bastardized to the point where you have some of the most challenging legislators, whether, they want to call themselves Democrat and they claim to be progressive, who will literally support things like mandatory minimums, right? I don't understand how they can be in the same sentence. And so when it comes to the races that Karen York is watching, given the work that I do on a daily basis in terms of connecting individuals with jobs, but also in my personal capacity as chair of the Workforce Development Committee for the Southwest Partnership Board, which is in Southwest Baltimore and Hollands Market, as a lifelong city resident who's lived in East, West, and now Southwest Baltimore, graduate of Baltimore City College, high school, city forever.
Okay, you have to do that.
I'm sorry, I just had to throw that out there. The races that I am watching, in no particular order, of course, the state's attorney's race, right? I mentioned it before. A significant portion of our working population is effectively unemployable as a result of their interaction with the criminal justice system. When I am in Annapolis, when the advocates are in Annapolis, we find, and Eddie will tell you this, many times our number one chief opposition is who? The state's attorneys, the prosecutors. And so you'll see across the country where not only are we focusing on those prosecutor races when it comes to police reform and accountability and what's happening in our courtrooms, I'm also looking for those prosecutors that are thinking and talking holistically, right? So I'm looking at what's happening in Philadelphia, right? I'm looking at all of these other cities and states where the prosecutors are not just going after those individuals that are terrorizing our communities and making sure that they are aligning appropriate consequences and punishment with the crime, but they're also thinking very critically, very deliberately about, if you're not sentenced to life, you're coming home. So how can we make sure that you are equipped with all of the resources and services that are necessary to ensure that you are good and ready? Because many times you're returning back to communities that were a hot mess when you left, and they a hot mess when you're coming back.
Right.
And so I'm looking at the state's attorney's races. I'm paying attention to every single individual who is running for Senate in Baltimore City, because in Baltimore City, the power in the Senate is critical. Right. It is critical. That is our upper chamber. Many times that is where, issues die or live. And so it is important that Baltimore City retains power in the sense of committee power, in the sense of being able to stand strong against leadership, being able to hold our position strong against those surrounding jurisdictions that many times continue to look at Baltimore City as if we're the bane of the state.
Right. We have a question from one of our viewers on YouTube who's asking, what proposed policies does the party have to increase education and jobs for their areas that might help to reduce crime and help to ease poverty. And so I just want to clarify, the question is, what proposed policies does the party have? I'm guessing they mean the guests have, because I'm not sure that they're referring to the Democratic Party, unless you do know a policy of the Democratic Party that would address
I know.
this.
My answer was going to be, if we're talking about the Democratic Party, I'm not sure. Outside of, the Fight for 15, of course, paid sick leave, of which Job Opportunities Task Force was, a part and actually led for the past 6 years with a number of over 150 organizations across the state. When it comes to party politics, very deliberate policies of how to improve conditions and outcomes for our working families. Outside of those two, I don't know much. But for the Job Opportunities Task Force, what we are talking about is wages and benefits, right? We're talking about a livable wage. When you talk about, Baltimore City, let's increase the minimum wage, but we also got to talk about rising costs. If we increase my wages, but it still costs me a hell of a lot of money for groceries and transportation and everything else, that's not really helping me, right?
If we fight for 15 and it now costs more.
Exactly. We've got to talk about the rising cost of just living, the cost of being poor, right? We got to talk about our businesses and connecting economic development with workforce development, right? Many times they're in silos, but if we want to bring businesses to our city, and we so focus on bringing businesses to our city, we got to make sure that we have workers that are ready to fill those jobs, because they will bring other workers.
Which is that education connection.
Absolutely. And so in addition to focusing on K through 12, we got to focus on adult education. We got to make sure that we're focusing on pre-GED and GED, and we have got to beef up our correctional education. I know that we remember, what was it, about 2-3 weeks ago, where we were dealing with an order from the state where they were limiting books behind the fence.
Yep.
And we had to push back against that, and thankfully Secretary Moyer rescinded that order to allow for there to be greater access to book vendors for individuals that are behind the fence. But these are the policies that we are looking at, the ones that, tend to be a bit nuanced, but they're not really nuanced. They just make folks uncomfortable when it comes to talking about them.
Right. And Eddie, you produced a series called Rattling the Bars, and your episode from last week, you talked about the fact that your time being incarcerated for a crime you didn't commit for 44 years, what you learned from the incarceration system is that it's not really set up to rehab or to support people who are returning home. What are some of the other things that you would put forward in terms of policies you'd want to see coming forward that were really progressive, particularly as it relates to returning citizens?
Okay, well, first, the example you used about the books, it was rescinded, but it shouldn't never have been put out there in the first place. I mean, you talk about no education in the criminal justice system. I think 8th grade education certificate is the mandatory policy in the prison system. But you can go and get a GED, but we know that recidivism is impacted by the amount of education a person has when he comes out, or she has when they come out. If you got a bachelor's degree, you got an 80% chance of staying out. If you got a GED, you got a 20% chance of staying out. And the cost is cheaper to educate somebody than it is to reincarcerate them, re-traum, and the trauma that's going to cause by that recidivism in terms of a victim and so on, right? So one, the money needs to be directed instead of overtime, instead of
for police.
It needs to be directed toward education, right? That's the first thing that needs to happen. So when you create these policies about taking away books, taking away visits, criminalizing the family, you break down that communications that people need to develop as whole, healthy human beings, right? So that's a problem. But the bigger problem, the elephant in the room, is that people are in these prison systems because an elite is robbing the community, making the community poor. whether it's the people that own stock in Wells Fargo, or whether it's the people that own AT&T or Facebook or whatever, they in the iPhone, they are getting filthy rich. We're paying the price down on the ground. They never come in contact with us. They're not harmed by the activities that result from their robbery. What we need in Maryland and in other municipalities is a wealth tax. We need to tax that wealth.
This is something that Ben Jealous talks about. Millionaire tax.
We supply security. We supply infrastructure. We supply ways in which they can fleece the community, but we don't supply any ways in which we can take care of the community. And we need to be talking. We need to have a discussion in Annapolis about that. Maryland is one of the richest states with some of the wealthiest people in the United States, and they don't contribute. They don't contribute to the education. They don't contribute to the safety of the community. They don't contribute to the health care, etc. They continue to drain the wealth out of our communities and out of our bodies. That needs to be addressed. A wealth tax will go a long way. The other thing, if you work in Baltimore, and there should be a grace period, but if you work in Baltimore, you need to live in Baltimore. And because you're taking Baltimore taxpayers' money. You need to be here and you need to help build the city better. And if you can't be here, then those jobs need to go to people that live in Baltimore. So that's one of the things that we need to be looking at in Annapolis as well as in the city. Other cities have done it and done it successfully, and it's then changed the calculus in those particular cities. We need to be thinking in terms of doing it, because we can't fix this. And I know you do the work down there. I come down there and I see you do the work, but they water every reform down, the compromises, water everything down to the point where you get something, but everybody's satisfied, but it's not what you need, and it doesn't straighten everything out. But it just gives you enough hope that the next oasis might have another drink of water.
Build on it. Continue to try to build on it. Because if you don't get anything, you literally not getting anything.
Well, thank you both. I want to check in again with some numbers. And again, speaking of Ben Jealous, who talked about the millionaire's tax at a town hall we hosted on education. His sentiment was, if you have a little more, you can give a little bit more, because it's not really going to impact your pockets. Ben is currently at 39.4%. Baker is at 30.3%. We have Joe Carter with 57.3% and J.D. Merrill with 36.3% in the 41st Legislative District. We have Senator Joan Carter Conway with 49.2% and Mary Washington with 50.8%. Still a tight race. In the House, in the 43rd, we have Maggie McIntosh still leading with 26.1%. Kurt Anderson is the next closest with 17.9%. And Regina Boyce, who is a newcomer to legislative politics, is also at 17.5%. In the 45th, Corey McCray, 61.6%, holding steadfast there. Nathaniel McFadden at 38.4%. And Ben Cardin won his Senate seat in a massive landslide, and I think that was probably to be expected. And so, we're going to keep moving. We're going to keep checking out these results. I want to say again, if you are watching live on Facebook or YouTube or on the realnews.com website, you can use the hashtag TRNN-elections to send us some questions, or you can comment in the comment section, and we'll pull some of your big questions in for this discussion. And we talked earlier today to a couple of our reporters, Stephen Janis and Taya Graham, and they talked with voters at the polls about the gubernatorial election. Why don't we take a look to some of the feedback we got from the street today around candidates for governor?
For governor, Ben Jealous, I think, is the biggest one that offers a lot of change. At least as a challenge to Governor I mean, for governor, I mean, Ben Jealous, I think, is the biggest one that offers a lot of change. I mean, at least as a challenge to Governor Hogan already. Just a lot of the other candidates there. I mean, well, the passing of Kevin Kamenetz, which really kind of shook things up. I mean, Ben Jealous, I think, was the obvious choice, even before that for me. But because he just offered so much of just a different view of how to go about things and really kind of address the problems here in Baltimore City where I live. So.
Are you looking at those Democrats? Do you feel like they're progressive? Are you looking for a progressive? Are you satisfied with Hogan?
I'm actually quite satisfied with Hogan, surprisingly, even though I'm a registered Democrat. But I will say that of the candidates, I thought it was a really great turnout. So it was definitely like a difficult decision.
And then let's see. Actually, why don't I go to Easy Jackson first, and then we'll come back and you'll have a ton of girl power, some of the most brilliant women in Baltimore working on behalf of kids and the environment. So let's go to Easy Jackson.
All right, thanks, Khalilah. Speaking of brilliant women, I'm standing here with Zakiya Sankara Jabbar. She is one of the co-founders of Racial Justice Now. How you doing, Zakiya?
I'm doing great.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that Racial Justice Now does?
Yeah, Racial Justice Now is an organization that was founded to end the school-to-prison pipeline. So we specifically focus on the needs of black children in our public schools.
How important is this election to the work that you're doing? Are there any specific races or issues that you're following real closely?
Education is extremely important for us, and so when we look at the data and look at the numbers for black children in the state of Maryland and across the United States, quite frankly, many of our parents and our other members are pretty much dismayed by what we see. So I definitely think the statewide races, the Senate race here with Jill Carter, the governor's race, all of them are very important, but because education is a local issue, we know that all of the smaller elections for county council, county executive, all those elections are extremely important. So we try to educate our members on who's our friends when it comes to education.
Yeah, education is a big one. I've been out to the polls talking to people last week during early vote, and it came up a lot. And when you talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, you talk about a youth detention center recently that was built here in the city, and schools being underfunded. Is the state's attorney's office somebody that you guys work with, reach out to, or want to work with?
Well, the state's attorney is something that is definitely important to us. We know that there is systemic, as you said, underfunding of education, but suddenly we can find all the funding in the world to build more youth prisons. We're certainly against building more youth prisons without providing adequate education. We believe that young people need to be surrounded by culturally relevant curriculum, school climates that are welcoming, and that are not just welcoming for the students, but also welcoming for parents. We know that our communities face a lot of different ecological issues that impact the education system. And so we think that not just education, but healthcare, everything that impacts our families is extremely important. So the state's attorney's office is extremely important, and we know it's definitely connected to education.
Well, thank you for the work that you're doing. Appreciate you. Thanks for coming out. Again, Zakiya Sankara Jabbar from Racial Justice Now. A lot of great activists in the room. We're going to keep talking to folks, but right now we're going to go back to you, Khalilah.
All right. Thanks, Easy. Love hearing from my sis Zakiya. Definitely someone who's been at the grassroots working heavily around the school-to-prison pipeline and making sure culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy and curriculum are being used in all schools. Again, earlier today, the Real News Network spoke with voters about the gubernatorial election. Voters said Ben Jealous seemed to be the only candidate worried about the environment. Another Democratic voter who said that they were happy with Hogan. And so we saw a lot of different opinions coming from people at the polls. And, it goes to show that it's really important for those of us who are advocates to get out and really help people understand the issues. I want to introduce Dr. Nicole Fabricant. Nikki is someone who has been working a ton with students at Ben Franklin High School in the Curtis Bay area. She's also a professor at Towson University. And Shannon Coleman Siciliano, she is the co-executive director of Strong Schools Maryland. So welcome, ladies.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So, again, on the gubernatorial race, we see Ben Jealous right now with a 9-point lead over Baker. He's at 39.4%. Baker at 30.3%. The closest person next is Jim Shea at 8.6%. What do we think? They say Ben Jealous is the only candidate who cares about the environment.
Amen to that is what I say. I definitely think his background on the NAACP, really taking a lead around issues of climate justice, thinking about renewable energy, wind, solar. He is the candidate who will move us forward in terms of the environment.
Yeah. Will you talk a little bit about the work you've been doing in Curtis Bay with the students from Ben Franklin? We heard from one of your students, Ray John. And I'm going to take a point of personal privilege. One of my own Baltimore kids is here today, my middle daughter. It's her 14th birthday today. Hi, Jameson. So she's off somewhere on her cell phone, not paying attention to mom, but I thought I'd give her a nice little shout out as we move into a conversation about youth advocacy and how young people are being engaged in making sure their environment is safe and that people have a place to live.
Absolutely. So for the past 3 years, we've been working at Benjamin Franklin High School. United Workers, a grassroots organization focused on issues of human rights, affordable housing, environmental justice, and Towson University launched a kind of participatory action project in the high school through environmental sciences, whereby youth from Curtis Bay define the kinds of research questions they want to ask. Much of it comes out of their own interests, walking to school, seeing certain kinds of things, breathing dirty air, seeing the largest open air coal pier in their community in front of their park where kids are playing. And so a lot of the kinds of questions really stem from their own experiences in this environment. And then throughout the course of a year, the students go out and do ethnographic research. Wow. So they are becoming at 15, Rajan, who's here tonight, is 15. He's a sophomore. And they're becoming researchers of their own community, essentially. And then we hope that they will be armed with a kind of a data set that will be powerful to young youth of color to be able to advocate, to push the city, particularly this mayor, around issues. This year's group focused on vacant houses, which is not directly an environmental justice issue, but that was of key concern to them. Right. And so they documented, they created stats around ownership, who owns the vacants, how and in what ways people are speculating upon land that will increase in value because of Port Covington and Kevin Plank's ideas for development. And then they're really advocating with this data to be able to say to the city, invest in our community.
So I got to cut in here. We're talking about the candidate that everyone is saying is for the environment.
Right.
We're going to the field. It sounds like Ben Jealous is won and Baker's conceded.
Wow.
And Rashawn Baker was endorsed by the majority of the Democratic establishment in the state. Martin O'Malley, Ben Cardin, Steny Hoyer, who is infamous now for Lake Tapes, where he tried to pressure a primary opponent to drop out of a race in Colorado, I believe. So we're going to be live for the next hour or so as final results come in and talk to some folks here. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Jessel. We're so glad that you were able to be down at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum for the Baker campaign, Jealous campaign. Congratulations to Ben Jealous. It looks like the first big contest between whether or not we have a progressive or someone who kind of represents the establishment being able to win in the state of Maryland. And so we want to see that happen down ballot, right? Whether or not that's going to be the case at the state level.
Right.
And even at the municipal level when we get in the next couple of years into city level race. But Ben Jealous is the nominee for the Democratic Party for governor.
Right.
Who'd have thunk it?
I know.
I would, but You know,
We need a transformation.
But you know, nationally, I think we've been seeing in some ways progressive candidates pushing in, but not necessarily winning their primaries, and this is huge.
This is huge.
Right.
Absolutely.
Shannon, you interviewed Ben Jealous as a co-executive director for Strong Schools. What were some of the takeaways from the interview you did with him?
Yeah, so Strong Schools Maryland, we are trying to build a grassroots campaign across the state to ensure that Maryland students have a world-class education, which basically means, you know, we're at a moment in time right now in Maryland where they're looking at rewriting education policy and funding our schools the way that they need to be funded with the Kerwin Commission. So for our organization, the Kerwin Commission and the recommendations that they put forth, that is the most important piece of, you know, education legislation that is potentially before us. So when I interviewed Ben Jealous, you know, he was really strong on the issue, and we look forward to working with him. I mean, one of his key areas, you know, he said that he's definitely in support of Kerwin. He also lifted free college tuition, you know, and again, from our perspective, we want to ensure that schools K through 12 and actually looking at early childhood, so from birth, that kids have what they need in Maryland to succeed, to even be able to, you know, to go to college.
Absolutely.
Well, Nikki, you talked about, you know, your students, and, you know, one of the recommendations in the Kerwin Commission's preliminary report was around career and technical education, and making sure that young people have the opportunities to be trained in the type of jobs where if they wanted to, for example, start their own construction company and redevelop the vacants in their community, they could.
And these are the kinds of questions we're thinking about. So how and in what ways can youth from that community be part of the reconstruction, the demolition, learn certain skill sets? But I wouldn't end there. It's also about building pipelines into higher education. So for us, this is about inspiring kids at a very young age to see social justice issues as critical to their forward movement, right? And how and what ways they could possibly move to the next stage, which would be higher education. And negotiating with universities that they have to also think about qualitative, not just quantitative assessments.
That's great. And, you know, with Kerwin, we potentially have the opportunity for kids starting at the end of 10th grade to go straight into, you know, getting certification or starting, you know, to take coursework where...
I'm sorry, I'm going to break in.
No problem. Okay.
We're going to go back to the field apparently to hear more from the Jealous campaign event.
Okay.
We're back to Jessel.
Say your name and why you're out here.
Tasha, we here with the Ben Jealous squad. Ben Jealous.
I'm George, the Ben Squad. And so it's been a tough race. Jealous was an underdog, and at the end of the election, he was surging in all the polls. We know there was a lot of undecided voters. What do you think? I mean, we don't have all the results yet. Only half of them. He's up so far. What do you think converted some of those undecided?
Today, last day was the one when we had to tell them Ben Jealous is here for us. Go out there and vote for Ben Jealous. We got a lot of strong votes. After all the undecided votes, it was a strong vote.
And it's nothing like being on foot and doing the work, because we did the work and we're going to see the results.
And so, you know, it would be a historic win for Ben Jealous, a progressive taking a big, you know, important governor's race. The opponent is Larry Hogan, and he's been popular among Democrats and Republicans. He's got one of the highest favorability ratings in the entire state. What are your thoughts on Larry Hogan's chances to win in November?
I don't think he has a chance. Right now, we have a strong person coming for the office. It's called Ben. His name is Ben Jealous. You feel me? He's coming to give us $15 minimum wage. He's coming to give us universal health care. He's going to end that. He says he's going to do. He's going to make it happen.
And so, do you think that those kind of policies that really have excited people today, like there's really progressive policies, no other candidates were talking about, you know, universal health care. No one is talking about a jobs program that if the private sector won't hire people, we'll get the state to step in. Do you think that's what the kind of stuff that people wanted to hear this election year?
Oh yeah, of course. That's what we go through out here. So, you know, the problems and everything that we go through throughout the city, you know, he's out here to take care of the problems that we have in the city. We really believe it. That's why we came out here and knocked doors and canvassed every day for him for the past 3 weeks.
And yeah.
I meant the real story.
And
here.
can you say your name too?
So I'm Tracy Lingo. I'm the staff director of Unite Here Local 7. We represent hotel and casino and food service workers throughout the city. And these are all members of ours who took time off of their jobs in the last 3 weeks to be out on the doors 6 days a week for Ben Jealous. And it's not just us, but the nurses and the teachers union and the SEIU all back Ben, because we know that there's not anybody else who's really fighting for working class Baltimore. And, that's really, I think, what we see in Baltimore is people are fed up with politicians because politicians don't listen to working.
That's crazy. So we heard some of those folk pretty much saying what you ladies were saying. It's time for people to strap their boots on and lace them up and get out there if they're planning to challenge Hogan. We heard one of the gentlemen just say, we're ready. Our next governor is going to be giving us $15 minimum wage, is going to be giving us health care, and that Hogan can't win is what he said. So, that brother is fired up, ready to go. That's a rallying cry for the NAACP, which Ben was the former CEO and president of. So, ladies, what do you think? Ben Jealous for governor?
I mean, I think,
it's exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, we all are kind of like, all right, this is early.
I know.
Yeah.
Right. Education is my thing.
Yeah.
Like, I am ready to have a governor who is really ready to commit to education and not just have some communication, talking points about funding education at the highest level, but doing something about the outcomes that we're seeing, really investing in education outcomes and opportunities for our kids.
Absolutely.
It's time.
Yeah, and I cut you off before. You were talking about the CTE recommendations and how important it is for, these policies to really be fleshed out and pushed forward.
Right. I mean, so the current commission, they're not just looking at, let's throw more money at education. I mean, they are rewriting education policy in a way that we have never seen. I mean, if Maryland, once we do pass this, because it will pass, we will be a model for the country.
We can be.
We can be, exactly. We've got to get it right. And we've got to have a governor who's going to ensure, that this happens. So with the CTE and, college readiness, we will have an opportunity for kids starting in 10th grade to start preparing themselves for that certification, start taking college courses, so that when you have a high school diploma in the state of Maryland, it really means something.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to those things, it's also going to be the case that 10th graders will have already achieved their high school requirements, right? And so we really have a chance to push in and take a look at equity, and particularly race equity as well. How are our young people in underserved and underrepresented school districts faring, whether it be based on race or it be based on income, right? We have Western Maryland and the Eastern Shore where we have folk who lived in sometimes abject poverty who also deserve the same opportunities to be able to have jobs for the future. And so we're going to be paying close attention to that.
I mean, this is a really unique time for not so typical coalitions across the state to really come together, because this is going to impact the entire state.
And I think it's time for us all to get working on this to make it happen, right? So how do we cut across environment, issues of racial justice, criminal justice reform, and the educational investment that Jealous is proposing? And
Absolutely.
Strap on those boots. I'm ready.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think people can rest on their laurels. And you couldn't hear this, but what the gentleman was saying before was basically that Jealous was able to win based on boots on the ground. That his, grassroots strategy, knocking every door, is what was able to propel him to such a decisive win that by 1040, we have the person who everyone kind of thought was going to sail into the Democratic nomination, conceding the election to a very progressive candidate.
Right.
So, we have some results coming in now from some of the other races down ballot. We have the state's attorney's office. Mosby's holding on with 51%, Bates at 29%. In the 41st legislative district, we have Joe Carter with 57%, J.D. Merrill with 36%. And it looks like we continue to have a statistical dead heat between Mary Washington and Joan Carter Conway. That's going to be a nail biter, I think, down to the wire. I want to take a second. We have some amazing coverage and content coming out of the Real News Network, and Easy Jackson, who has been checking in on the pulse, and it's so exciting. You can feel the energy here. He's going to be producing a show tomorrow to build on a show that he's been doing at the network called The Whole Bushel. And during The Whole Bushel, he interviews folk, and he has rising and cutting-edge artists from the music scene here in Baltimore who perform on The Whole Bushel. Tomorrow's going to be Whole Bushel Live here at Ida B's. So there's going to be a little bit of a crab feast here at Ida B's. So you can still get tickets for the Whole Bushel Live. But why don't we go to a promo for the event tomorrow?
Great.
What's good, y'all? I'm Easy Jackson for the Real News Network, and I'd like to invite you to the Whole Bushel Live. The Whole Bushel was a show where I sat down with performing artists. We ate crabs, which is something we do here in Baltimore, and you got to see the artists perform. Well, now you get to come and eat crabs with us. So if you haven't had a Maryland-style crab feast yet, this is your opportunity. And if you're familiar with how we get down, you should definitely be in the building. June 27th at 7 p.m., come on down to Ida B's table for the Whole Bushel Live. We're going to have my good friends Brooks Long and Bobby Rush with us. So bring an appetite and an ear for some good music. I guarantee you it's going to be a good time. Go to Eventbrite, search the Whole Bushel for all the details, and mark your calendar accordingly. All right, see y'all soon.
All right, so you definitely don't want to miss that. That is going to be dope. Be there or be square, or be at Ida B's. How about that? So again, the energy here is so live. We got the feed in from the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, which is so apropos. Here in Baltimore City, where the Jealous campaign is celebrating their primary win. What are you guys looking forward to after this election? You know, a lot of times people complain that you don't see candidates in your communities and engaging with people regularly to know issues like the issues that Rajan is putting forward, or that the communities you're hearing from around the state are speaking to.
You know, I mean, I have to say, I honestly have never really paid attention to Central Committee.
This has come up on every panel.
I'm going to be honest. Like, I go into the booth, I'm like, oh, yeah, like, who's that? Who? Right, exactly, who? I mean, this time, I had people knocking on my door for Central Committee. I researched folks. I really think that this is a time where people are realizing we can no longer just sit back and let things happen. Absolutely. And we need to pay attention to things like Central Committee. So I think people are going to be leaning a lot on their Central Committee to get out there, stay engaged. I also think that in the Trump era, you know, folks are, you know, they're waking up again, and realizing that, yeah, it's time to put on boots and, you know, and hit the ground and stay active and stay engaged. So,
going back to sleep. Right. So I see over my shoulder also in the county executive race, it's still a statistical dead heat between Olszewski, Jim Broshin, and Vicky Allman, teetering between 32 and 33%. Why don't we go back to Easy and listen to what's going on here at Ida B's and how people are feeling. Thank you, ladies. I'm glad you could join me.
Thank you.
It's Khalilah. Again, like we talked about, a lot of amazing people in the building. I'm sitting here right now with Natasha Murphy. She is the Deputy Director of Advocacy for Black Girls Vote. What's up, Natasha?
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. You want to tell us a little bit about Black Girls Vote and the work you guys do?
Sure, absolutely. So we are a nonpartisan grassroots organization based right here in Baltimore City, and we're all about engaging, educating, and empowering Black women and other women of color to use our vote as our voice and make sure that we're demanding policy in exchange for our vote.
Awesome. Is there anything specific about this race this time? Any of the particular races or issues that are up for vote that stand out for you all that you're paying attention to particularly?
one race in particular. However, the 2018 primary election is really the first time since 2016 that voters have had the opportunity to come out in mass and ask for change. And so we've been really excited and invigorated to see that the electorate, particularly here in Baltimore, has been super excited. And, the results from tonight have been really interesting to see. A lot of the establishment candidates that we may have expected to win, they are not having the outcome that we would have expected. So.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for all the great work you're doing. Thanks for coming out. Again, Natasha Murphy, Deputy Director of Advocacy for Black Girls Vote. And I think we're going to go back to you, Khalilah.
Easy, and thanks, Natasha. Black Girls Vote has been doing big things, not only here in Baltimore, but they are moving their effort nationally to make sure that people recognize the power of black women when it comes to the legislative process. And not only that, black women are, behind the scenes doing the work, that we're not the mules of the Democratic Party, that we should be out front and we should be running for office and achieving those big party seats and being appointed to positions where we can really use our resources and, frankly, our black girl magic in many ways. I'm going to go quickly to Jessel Noor again at the Jealous campaign, and then we'll get back to this panel.
Betty, your purse. You want to take your purse? Can you grab that purse that she's going to hand down, please? Thank you.
So this is Jessel Noor at The Real News. We're expecting Ben Jealous to come on the stage in just a few minutes. You can see some of the key supporters behind him. That's Van Jones on the right, members of different community groups. That's Betty Weller in the center, the head of the Maryland State Education Association. Their 80,000 members voted to endorse Ben Jealous. Even the voters in the primary, even in PG County, where Rushern Baker, the main opponent, was PG County executive for the last 8 years, they even voted to endorse Ben Jealous. So right now we are waiting to for Ben Jealous to take the stage and discuss the victory.
All right, looks like we have huge energy there at the Jealous campaign. Do we know if he's coming to the stage? Got really, really excited there. All right. I think if you can't tell right now, folk are excited, folk are energized and ready to go. And so they want to hear from their candidate who was able to pull out a victory here in the state of Maryland for progressive policies. And we want to make sure that we can hear from Ben Jealous, and we are watching the scene here at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. Folk are excited, right? Looks like their candidate is coming forward right now to address the room there at the Reginald F. Lewis. You can almost feel that energy blocks away here at Ida B's. All right, here we see his running mate. Looks like we're going to hear from Ben Jealous's running mate.
For
All right, so we are back. We'll get back to the Reginald F. Lewis when Ben Jealous hits the stage. I want to introduce the good people next to me. We have my brother Jamal Jones, who's co-executive director of the Baltimore Algebra Project. Power to the people.
Thank you.
Also have Melissa Schober, who is a staunch health and education advocate here in Baltimore City.
Thanks so much.
If you don't have your receipts, trust and believe that Melissa has those receipts already. If she's asking you a question and asking you for some proof, trust that she already has the proof. You just need to step up and bring it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So education was a huge issue in this election. And I think we're kind of seeing that across the country, that particularly in states where you have teachers who are protesting to make sure and striking to make sure they can get a livable wage, to make sure that schools are fully funded. And we see here in the state of Maryland, the Commission on Innovation and Excellence, also known as the Kerwin Commission, is a hot ticket item here. During the campaign season, we saw every single person running for office, whenever they got up to any podium, would say, I support Kerwin. But many community members don't know what that meant. Doesn't know what that meant, and they don't know what it means. And activists and community advocates are really hitting the streets to connect with the grassroots community on educating them about this once-in-a-generation opportunity with the Kerwin Commission. Will you talk a little bit about that, Jamal?
Well, I think the first thing to know is that I don't think the candidates themselves know what that means, right? Like the idea, I support a thing, but I'm real unclear about what that thing is. It reminds me a whole lot about the national conversation about race equity in the first place. So a whole lot of people talking, not a whole lot of people understand what they're talking about. I think for me in particular, and for the subset of folks that I represent and the groups of folks that I work with, everybody was weak on education. Only one or two candidates in the entire race even said anything remotely along the lines of this is how I would fund Kerwin. So I think that folks who are in this race and have been in the race have really been doing this thing where white people prop themselves up off of black bodies. A lot of the candidates would say stuff like, my wife teaches city schools, right? As if that makes you understand
Tell us how you
what
really
that
feel.
is, right? You feel me? Like that. So I think that there's that, and I think also
or that they were a teacher.
Right.
I taught a couple, 2-3 years.
Or I taught for a couple years and then I dipped. No, that's actually the problem, that you're giving actual evidence for why I shouldn't rock with you. And I think that's what it really is. I think a lot of this is the same bag of tricks over the course of decades, and people finally starting to catch on, at least to the idea that people talk about stuff that they don't know about.
Right.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think apart from the issues that you raised, one of the key questions that I didn't have answered at any of the many forums was, so before Kerwin, we had this thing called the Thornton Commission that was supposed to fix many of the problems that Kerwin is now grappling with. Right. And so only 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, we had this other commission that was going to do wonderful things with funding, and Baltimore City was going to be made whole. And here we are today having the conversation again. And when you ask many gubernatorial candidates, even ones that I liked very well, so what's going to be different about this time? You got a lot of blank stares for people, or, well, I believe in this because, to follow your train of thought, my child attends public school.
It's got to be good because my family's in city schools.
Yeah.
No.
Right.
That's not a qualification.
Right. I mean, you both are talking a bit about equity. Melissa, I've heard you talk about equitable access to programming. What are you guys hoping that we can accomplish with the Kerwin Commission, and how we can push forward for the types of things that we want to see, so that we're not another 15 years down the line saying, oh, we need to fully fund Kerwin, in the same way we saw Thornton start to increase funding for communities that were under-resourced, and then it kind of plateaued. It actually fell off a little bit at the Great Recession of 2007, and then it plateaued, right? So city schools at this point, I think, are underfunded based on the Thornton Commission.
About $300 million.
$300 million annually.
Give or take.
Give or take a couple million.
Right.
Yeah, but about at least, depending on whose estimates you believe, someplace in the $290 million range for city schools, give or take some millions of dollars. I mean, for me, the Kerwin Commission needs that explicit race equity lens. It needs explicit attention to restoration of funds for districts that have been historically underfunded, both at the state and local level. And it needs attention to community schools, by which I mean not a model that is imposed upon Baltimore City, but a model that is truly community-led, with a needs assessment led by people in that community to determine what that community school needs to be for them and their families. Not what I think is best, not what you think is best, what people in that building with children in that building need.
Right. So, Jamal and I organized with a new coalition called the Coalition of Black Leaders in Education, and we are focusing work on, making sure that there are clear lines of communication from city schools and elected officials at the state level, who sometimes will punt and say, well, we're not responsible for city schools. Yeah, but we elected you and we expect you to fight for us in Annapolis. And so the Coalition of Black Leaders in Education is doing just that. We're asking for a focus more on race equity specifically, and distinct from income inequity, which is also important. But historically, you have folk like Governor Hogan say, we give Baltimore City enough, right? They always have their hand out. I like to say, so goes Baltimore, so goes the state of Maryland. You actually haven't funded them at the level that would make sense for equity, right? There's a difference between equal funding and equitable funding, and a lot of people tend not to understand that.
Well, it's weird to me, right? Like, I spend a lot of time dealing with this question of equity and, like, how to frame it, how to phrase it, how to package it, how to, like, send it so that they receive it the right way.
Right.
And I guess the closest thing I've gotten to it is, like, it's no different than a house, right? Like, when a person is breaking down the equity in a house, somebody has to lose something in order for someone else to gain something. And it's not a big deal. When we start talking about everything else, it's weird, right? Like, there's this thing called, like, the customs of Baltimore, like, so it's like an old saying, it's like, so goes the customs in Baltimore. There are so many anecdotal behaviors that are just not actually tracked, microaggressions, that ultimately, like, we have a much more racialized Baltimore than folks understand. Like, two Baltimores, quite frankly, right? And the fact of the matter is, the people who tend to be in leadership don't come from the Baltimore that get a whole lot of, like, looks. Don't come from the spaces where, like, people are literally, like, within those frames of inequity all the time.
Right.
We're talking about a bunch of folks who, like, read a couple articles, read some books, and now they're experts.
Regardless of race, right?
Regardless of race.
Yeah.
And that's exacerbated here in the city by the fact that we have an appointed school board. And so we, as citizens, as parents, as community members, have very little ability to influence policies here at home, because our school board, now it's returned to mayoral control, but was joint mayoral gubernatorial for a long time. So many steps removed from people with children in the buildings, with community members who know the buildings well. And those kinds of problems will not be solved by Kerwin. And so part of what the state race is going on tonight of interest, I think, to many education advocates is who supports a return of that power to parents and communities here in the city, as opposed to an appointed board.
Yep, and like that's
so
the whole
I want to break in for a second. Sounds like Marilyn Mosby is being declared the winner by multiple outlets. The state's attorney's office race. We were tracking her results all night, and she had a solid 50% or higher lead. Marilyn Mosby.
She got to throw down.
Yeah. There's so much more to be done.
Yeah, there remains a lot of work to do, particularly in juvenile justice.
I don't envy her position, and quite frankly, like, I think that what she needs to do is take the gloves off this go round. Like, no more dealing with people in, like, nice political ways. Like, say the things that you can't say, so that we can deal with the things that we can't deal with.
Right. I think this election shows that people will support her. Right. Even if there are ways that her office can improve. You know, if there are cases that her office should stop trying because perhaps they're, not going to win that trial for the fourth time. You know, we have different places where you have community members saying winning should not be the priority, and instead it should be the people. And you see her office doing that in many different ways, including in education, right? She does these pop-up events in the summertime. She's been doing that for the past few years, and is doing that again. There are things that law enforcement can do and the entire judicial system can do to make sure young people feel like they're a part of justice and not that they're on the outside of justice. Speaking of which, we heard today that at Patapsco Elementary School that they could not use it as a polling location because of mice and fleas, which had to exist more than a week ago when school let out. What are thoughts on what we saw this winter in terms of school facilities and also the investment? You talk about the lack of an elected school board, and again, you have folk punting, whether it be city council saying, I'm not responsible for the schools, or the mayor's office, I'm not responsible for the schools. And in some ways, leaving the school district out there to fend for itself, absent a citywide economic development strategy.
Yeah, it's really troubling, and I think for those of us who are in city schools, have children in city schools, have been paying attention, the fact that a school had mice and fleas, as appalling as that is not surprising. In 2012, the city put out the Jacobs Report, which detailed the condition of city schools. We have the oldest physical plan of the entire 24 jurisdictions here, and well over 3/4 of our buildings are rated in poor condition. So this is not a surprise, as unfortunate, as tragic as it is, as it bespeaks a larger problem. And yeah, for too long, as an advocate here in the city, I've seen the state and the city sort of point fingers at each other, and no one wants to own the problem. So in the absence of that leadership coming from either the city or the state, it needs to be returned to parents and community. And to the extent that parent voices are voting here tonight, hopefully they'll be making a decision to support candidates who are interested in returning that power to parents and communities.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so for me, it's an interesting thought. I actually, like, the rats in them is my manners. Because the way that people treat Baltimore, you need rats and stuff in order for people to pay attention.
Yeah.
Like even in the way that you described it, it's like everyone leaves us out there just kind of as a space to thrive on. Like, even when I look at this equity question, it's like, even like if we look at equity for the school district and we don't look at procurement processes, who gets what contracts, like those are dollars that circulate within communities. And just in terms of the buildings, like conditions, it's gonna be like that until we fix it. And the problem is, right, like the city giving away its ability to have control over how stuff goes here. It like functionally rendered the school district, they would say,
right.
You are the state-sanctioned entity in control of the operations here, but basically you was like, nah, I'm good.
Right, no responsibility. I want to take a second and break to Easy Jackson. He's going to talk a couple of minutes with Nicole Mundell, who, other than being a candidate for a state central committee, is also with the Out for Justice Coalition. Let's go to Easy.
Thanks, Khalilah. Yeah, I'm here with Nicole Mundell. She's the executive director of Out for Justice. Nicole Hansen. I'm sorry, she's Nicole Hansen from Out for Justice. How you feeling, Nicole?
I'm feeling well.
It's been a long day. You also ran for state central committee.
I did.
How you feel about today?
I feel good about today. I think the voters were interested in the central committee race when they got to meet many of the candidates out at the polls and got to hear what was so important about central committee, which is typically a race that they don't hear much about, right? It's not something that's high on the totem pole. So to be running for Democratic Central Committee, we really had to educate the voters about the job description and made them want to say, oh, well, I think I'm interested in making sure that there's a group of people who hold the party accountable and translates the needs of the constituents back to the Democratic Party, a group of people who want to register voters and engage voters back into the party. So
you now with Out for Justice, you all do a lot of work with offenders coming home, helping them get acclimated. Huh?
Yes.
How do you feel? So Marilyn Mosby, state's attorney, just got announced winner of her primary race. How do you feel about that?
think the people spoke, right? The voters knew that is who they wanted to be their next state's attorney. They were knowledgeable about what she had done in the past, and the voters of Baltimore was satisfied with their state's attorney, and so they decided to re-elect her.
Now she was criticized. She was criticized for, her work with the officers responsible for Freddie Gray's death. She's also been highly criticized for Keith Davis Jr., who had his third case, and they're still holding him. Third mistrial, they're still holding him. But then also, she's been praised for her work around the Gun Trace Task Force. Has any of that discussion come up in your talks as you move on?
It has. Everything about her administration comes up in discussions around people who support her or who don't support her. But definitely people who support her, all of those issues come up in discussion. Sure they do.
What about the governor's race? So Ben Jealous just won his primary. He's going to be going up against Larry Hogan in the fall. How do you feel about that one?
I think that the Democratic Party has some work to do. I think they have some work to do. So.
All right, well, there you have it. Nicole, thanks for talking to us. Thanks for coming out. Khalilah, I guess we want to go back to you.
How old is yours?
All right, we're back. We're back. 8-year-old and a 6-year-old. So, we talked to several voters today while we were out in the community, and education policy and youth was top of mind for a number of folk. Why don't we go to some video from what we saw earlier today from the polls in regards to education. Or not. Here we go.
When you were looking at candidates, did you hear any of them that had a plan that When you were looking at candidates, did you hear any of them that had a plan that really spoke to you to improve education in Baltimore?
Well, not really. I hear the same old rhetoric, so I'm just hoping that somebody have a heart and can get down and do the things that they're supposed to do.
I think I would like to see change as it pertains to our schools and our youth. When I came up in Baltimore, we had rec centers, we had free camps. We have resources. Now it just feels like no one really cares about what goes on with the youth, but at the end of the day, they are our foundation. Because if we don't take care of them and cover them, then who's going to take care of us when we get older? So that is the biggest concern that I have.
Voters have some serious questions about how elected officials are going to make education policy a priority, how they're going to apply an equity lens, how they're going to support youth. Locally, if we want to pull down for just a second, Baltimore City itself is beginning the process to establish its own equity policy. You both were at the recent public forum. What were some of the things you heard out of that?
So there were a lot of the usual players in the room, I think partially because the first meeting was scheduled at 4 p.m. on the last day of school, and several of us, I see your face, raised the fact that maybe beginning the conversation on equity at 4 p.m. on the last day of school is not a great way to open the process.
No.
Particularly with an appointed board. So I'm...
All right, so I think we have another winning candidate coming in the room. Jill Carter has just entered Adaby's table. People are hyped.
I'm hyped.
Jamal's hyped. Senate candidate, current senator in the 41st Legislative District, former delegate in the 41st Legislative District, Jill Carter, has joined us at Adaby's table, and we're going to talk to Jill in a few, but I want to let you go ahead and talk a bit more about that equity policy.
Just that, and I think advocates over and over, I think everyone in the room said a policy is wonderful, but a policy is only as good as the implementation of said policy with measurable indicators that are important to the people in those buildings. So words on a page,
right?
we have lots of words on lots of pages in Baltimore City, and our children are still not well served by many of those words on pages. And what we really need to be looking at and making a concerted effort for is the implementation of those policies with community oversight and involvement, and not just a top-down approach. So I'm thrilled that the school board started the equity process from the beginning, inviting advocates to comment. I am a little less thrilled that the process took the normal board process, which is not friendly to families.
Right.
But advocates are pushing hard to reform that and have outside sessions away from North Avenue in communities as the summer goes on.
Go ahead.
So for me, the equity policy idea, we're putting the cart in front of the horse. How do you make a policy about something that you're not real sure about? Again, like the whole concept with the politicians to begin with.
Agreed. I think we want to switch out to the Jealous campaign again. He's taking the stage at the Reginald F. Lewis. Let's go to Jocelyn.
Don't forget what my colleague said. I will stand up for you.
Yeah.
That's our new governor. And go out there, knock on the doors of Lottie, Dottie, and everybody.
All right, we're back. So, we hear the energy here when a progressive candidate comes into the room, and, this is not a Jill Carter campaign rally. It's just a room full of people. Some of her supporters are here, but these are just average citizens who are excited about this race. This entire night has centered around, from our vantage point, can progressive candidates win in Baltimore and the state of Maryland? And we see, first and foremost, Ben Jealous winning in the gubernatorial race here, which something up until hours ago no one believed was going to happen. What are your thoughts? You gave me I don't know.
Because that's where I'm at.
Okay.
And it's because Maryland like to do this thing where they posture themselves as like not racist and then do a different thing at the poll. I feel like the lens is just on folks right now. And so I'm curious to see what happens in November, right? Because we're talking about a governor who has the highest approval rating forever. Like significantly, the makeup structure of what you need to win a governor race here is made up of all the counties and districts that he's a part of. Like, for me, the question is, do we renege, right? I want to see the numbers after the November election just to see relatively are they the same? Because there's a lot of people who will tell you, I'm not racist, and then go into a voting poll and then pick Donald Trump.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I don't have a lot to offer on the gubernatorial race, but on Jill Carter's win, as someone who is interested in education advocacy, she's been a huge advocate in Annapolis for some, at times, unpopular policies, particularly around school discipline and law enforcement officers in our schools and disparate effects of discipline. So I don't live in the 41st, but I'm thrilled to see that she won her race and know that we have another voice for kids in the state.
I'm excited.
You're excited.
That's OG right there.
Yeah.
That's like if you're trying to learn how to operate in space with people and still maintain your class, Jill can teach you.
Yeah. I mean, you had a situation where you had a relative newcomer, and I say relative because although he is 27, 28 years old, he is a part of a family that's had a bit of a political dynasty in the state, being the son-in-law of Martin O'Malley. There were parts of the campaign that did not resonate with a lot of people in terms of accusations about laziness of someone who's been an activist for over 30 years based on missing some of her votes in Annapolis, of the many votes that she needed to take. What are some thoughts on what is possible when we have candidates who have deep roots and commitment in community taking on some of these big issues, including education and including fighting for racial justice in a climate where it's more tolerable when perhaps it may not have been before?
I mean, to me, again, not living in the 41st, but still my questions for the mayoral campaign were very much around that. Their accusations flew about Jill Carter's record, to which I responded, so you were at North Avenue, in which we saw an increase in suspensions and expulsions for students of color. If you want to run on your record and you want to say that she's lazy and run on and be accusatory about her record, fine. Let's put it all out on the table. Let's look at the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights data from the U.S. Department of Ed, because they look terrible in the years that you were a special assistant at North Avenue. And so either we're going to have the whole conversation or we're not going to have any of the conversation. But I get really cranky when people are coming to the table, this is my record, but it's a sliver, it's a slice, it's carved, and it's shaped in a way to appeal to a certain portion of the 41st District, which for folks not from Baltimore spans some pretty diverse neighborhoods that are wealthier and whiter than average and much different than that.
I mean, this is what I say. When I was growing up, right, there was a saying around the way. If you tried in that fight and you can't like win, grab a brick. And it's real bad, but that's essentially what happened, right? Like, there's nothing to stand on. There's like an entire like the demographic makeup. For me, race is always at the corner of everything. And I know Meryl personally, right? Like, we went to school together, full disclosure. And still, like, bro, that's a 70% black district. What you doing? Like, can we put that on the table? And it's like, well, no, I'm talking about her, like, her attendance. These are facts. It's like, okay, facts are just that, right? Naming that she missed stuff is not the same as naming what she did. Both are facts, though. So if you go on and paint a particular painting, then you gotta like own that. And I think that like this is a learning opportunity for him and quite frankly for like white Baltimore. Like yo, actually there's power that don't come in the form of dollars.
Right. I mean, yeah, you know, wish I could have had him here tonight, but Dr. Lawrence Brown talks about the white L in Baltimore and the black butterfly and, you know, how much people take for granted. Also, the Real News Network has been doing reporting around the 14th Councilmatic District, which represents some of the deepest poverty and greatest wealth in Baltimore. And I think sometimes we see people trying to step into politics who don't really tend to the idea that, you know, some people are from Baltimore and some people are from Baltimore, right?
Facts.
And
Facts.
you know, I even caution my own three daughters about this. Like, if you're gonna claim credential of being from Baltimore, you better be out in the community with our people, right? You don't get to hide from, you know, the majority of the city and then claim to be speaking for it. Like you said, you know, sometimes all our skinfolk and our kinfolk, and you have people who come out there who look like you, but you know, they've lived in a middle class, working class community. They've had relative affluence. They go to Mount Washington or Roland Park Elementary School. They go on to City or Poly or Western, or they might have gone to one of the awesome Catholic schools in the district or some of our independent schools. And then they say, I'm from Baltimore. You need to trust me with your vote and trust that I'm going to represent you. And I think we saw a little bit of that in the Merrill case, right? Like, you're saying that 3 years as a teacher means you understand what's necessary for education reform. You're saying that despite being a young white man, that you are the best candidate to represent a 70+% black legislative district. And so, you know, it's looking so far right now that, you know, we may be winning the progressive race tonight. Why don't we take a look at what some additional voters were saying in the field today about, you know, what they were hoping for in this election and what they expect from candidates going forward after the primary.
I'm going to be honest, I didn't vote for the state's attorney because I think they're all trash. I'll be honest. I don't think any of them are great. I think if there's anything that really needs to change, I think it's the justice system here in Baltimore. It's a complete mess. And, you know, I didn't want to feel like I had a hand in electing any of those people because I didn't think they were very good.
nominee. Before I say anything else, let me thank Congressman Cummings, Mayor Pugh, Chairman Matthews, Chairwoman Kathleen Matthews for being here with us tonight. Let me thank my mom for that wonderful introduction. And let me thank the men and women who ran beside me for this nomination. I've spoken with several of them tonight, and we are ready to pull our party together and go out there and beat Larry Hogan. I'm the son of two teachers in Baltimore who were civil rights workers. One, a black woman who grew up in West Baltimore's McCullough Homes, and who traces her roots to slaves turned statesmen in Virginia. The other, a white man whose family from New England fought and bled in the Revolutionary War. My parents left Maryland in 1966 because their interracial marriage was illegal. We've come a long way since those days, and we have come a long way in this campaign. Today we come together from all corners of Maryland to send a message to the Republican administration in Annapolis that their time in power is coming to an end. Voters in Maryland now have a clear choice. Larry Hogan's go along to get along politics, and his policies on almost every issue stand in direct contrast to those I laid out in this campaign. Tonight I want to talk to you about the promise of Maryland. The story of my parents is the promise of Maryland. A multicultural and interracial state that is determined to move forward and refuses to go back to a time where people were turned against each other because of what they look like, who they love, or by what name they call God, if any at all. Now, you kids are a living testament to that progress. We won this primary because we talked with the people about how to achieve the promise of Maryland. We have detailed proposals on fully funding education and creating tuition-free public college again. On building an economy that works for everyone and revitalizing our great cities, including Baltimore. On ending mass incarceration and the opioid crisis that is killing more people than bullets are in our city. And all across our state.
All right. Welcome back. Thank you for sticking with us through the night. We have an amazing night, lots of energy. I want to thank Jamal Jones and Melissa Schober for talking education. We now have are you the Robin or the Batman?
Am I what?
Are you Robin or Batman?
I'm Robin tonight.
How about this?
Yeah.
You can be T'Challa and I can be Nakia. How about that?
I'm down with that.
All right.
Let's go.
Speaking of Wakanda Forever, so JD Merrill hasn't conceded the race to you, but right now you, the people of the 41st Legislative District have been decidedly voting for you today. As we can see, you have about 57% of the vote right now. You have been driving home after Nathaniel Oakes was no longer able to run for this office. You were appointed by the Democratic Central Committee. Actually, the Democratic Central Committee did not make a decision and allowed Larry Hogan to make the decision, which was to appoint you to fill the vacant Senate seat that Nathaniel Oakes vacated. So, Senator Jill P. Carter, what's going on? How's your day going? What have you been doing today?
I've been riding around all day, just visiting the polls, trying to inspire and encourage volunteers. I want to say something very significant because one of the aspects of this campaign was I was very, very out-financed. And we had, and I think this is unprecedented in 2018, for a senatorial race, we had a full volunteer staff working the polls. Most of our staff for the whole campaign was volunteer.
Yeah.
So our campaign was truly a labor of love.
Again, I said
a labor of love, and
41st
love,
district
love
has
outweighs
been voting for you
everything.
overwhelmingly, yes, and that's all love, right? Because
Yeah, you
it
could
wasn't all
totally
money.
see it throughout your whole campaign. Everybody who stepped up, even today, just looking at the post, I think I saw more of your people posting about you than any of the other candidates, which I thought was awesome. You're probably like neck and neck with Ben Jealous today. But your race is significant. I don't think a lot of people know this, but your opponent, J.D. Merrill, is the son-in-law of Martin O'Malley, who, when was governor, did blackball you as one of the elected officials, as a delegate there. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that. But if you can, if you could talk just a little bit about that and what this means now, coming back to Annapolis, and the type of work you're going to be able to get done.
Well, I hope I'll be able to get a lot of work done. As one of 47 and being in the Senate, and with all of the new people coming into the Senate, I'll be somewhat of a senior senator, right? Which is very interesting.
Yeah.
But I do feel that today was a bit of vindication, not just because of the way that Martin O'Malley marginalized me as a delegate, simply because I spoke out against the inhumane practice of illegal arrest en masse in Baltimore City, but the idea that in order to retain power over the largest majority black voting district in Baltimore City, they moved his son-in-law into the district, financed his campaign heavily, spent an entire year campaigning every day as a full-time job, and then spent about 50% of their, if not more, of their campaign messaging on attacking me, attacking my record, attacking my legacy, attacking my entire legislative career, and even going further than that, which really struck a chord with me, attacking my legacy, my family legacy, to propose that all I do is talk about civil rights and this guy would actually do something about it. It was an insult beyond any kind of belief. And so I found the campaign a little unpleasant. I wasn't happy for most of the campaign, and I thought that was upsetting because you're supposed to feel good about something, but because of the attacks, I really didn't enjoy the campaign very much. I just was like really much looking for the end. I believe that I would be successful at the end, but I wasn't certain because, you know, when someone comes with all of that money and all of those attacks, you don't know how much it's going to penetrate your base. And so I knew I had high favorability, but I wasn't sure if they keep attacking the character, attacking legitimacy, attacking the credibility, how much is the base going to stay? I didn't know. So tonight I felt good. I felt good actually in early voting because I felt an overwhelming amount of support even then. But you know, you never know. So
yeah, when we were out in the community, Zizi was out at the poll stations talking with residents. What were you hearing when you were out there?
Well, I was mostly in District 43. So mostly people were concerned about education, crime and healthcare, and then of course the corruption with the Baltimore City Police Department. So, you know, I think, you know, mass incarceration came up, those types of things, police reform definitely came up as a concern for people. So, I mean, and I think that's even reflected in your race and in your district, you know, that so many people came out for you and in support of you because they understand what you represent and what you're going to go to Annapolis to get done. But you have family here tonight, right? So I want you to talk a little bit about that because there's that a lot of that has been a lot of energy behind your campaign too. And I just think it's awesome. They're all here. Plenty of people here in Jill Carter shirts. They can't wait for her to get off this mic,
right?
So they can party.
Tell us about your people. Who came down for you?
Tell us about your people.
So my sister, who is my rock, you know, we lost our mom. Guess what? Exactly 2 years ago today was my mom's funeral. So I always knew that election day was significant because it was 2 years since my mom passed. So my sister is my rock. She's my life. And she went hard for me. She banged for me very hard this race. And then a lot of people on my father's side of the family from North Carolina have come here from Virginia and North Carolina and Southern Maryland and New York just to help me with this campaign today. So this really, really brought us together because we understood. So it's interesting because my family was sort of used to me being a delegate, and really initially, like a lot of the people in the public didn't think this was going to be a real challenge. They were like, "Oh, you got this." Right. And so then one day I was like, "Well, no, you see, the O'Malley machine, the Democrat machine, is running a very racist and a very sexist campaign against me, and I fear that because they have so much more money, they might actually destroy my credibility in the community." I was concerned about it. And so when I started telling people, like, really? Yeah. Oh, we didn't know that. Right. And the more I talked about it, the more people were like, oh, that's not going to happen.
So what are your plans going forward besides taking a long deserved rest?
So I'm excited because in addition to my victory tonight, which is really the people's victory, we have new blood that appears in the Senate. This is going to be a new day. This is going to be a new day in the Senate. And so I'm excited because I think that unlike in the House of Delegates, there will actually be a whole coalition of people, of senators, progressive-minded and new blood senators to work with me on issues. And so, of course, we have the whole education equity issue. And it's incumbent upon the members of the Baltimore delegation in particular to fight vigorously for equitable funding for Baltimore City. That is always a challenge in the legislature where they create a false narrative that Baltimore City gets way too much all the time and we're just wasteful. And so we need strong advocates for equity, not just for the new funding formulas to be adequate, but to also to take into account the underfunding over decades and to be, we need, reparations funding is really what we need.
Yeah, Article 8 of the Maryland Constitution is the education article. It's the only entitlement that residents of Maryland have is to an adequate and fully funded educational system.
I want to speak about that just for a second because when I was in the House of Delegates, and even when I was new and naive, and maybe I still retain some naivete to a certain extent, I never understood the discussion about, well, how are we going to pay for education?
Pay for it
We
first.
have one funding mandate under the Constitution to provide for a thorough and efficient system of public education.
That's right.
That means that everything else is secondary, and we take care of education funding first out of the resources that we have. Period. And it's always been weird that we have this conversation all the time about how we pay for education. It makes no sense.
That's something that we heard come up from the gubernatorial candidates when we had our education town hall is the concept of you pay for education first. Ben Jealous said it, Rashawn Baker said it, and at the town hall it was Liz Embry in his stead. You pay for education first, and then you discuss other priorities, but it also has to be a part of an equitable economic development strategy that is taking account all citizens, right? And not just some parts of the state who, may have more money and say you need to focus on us.
Well, the system has always been inequitable because of the tax-based financing. And that's something that we have to take into account as we move forward. But can I just backtrack a second on the significance of Ben Jealous' victory tonight and mine? You've got two civil rights-minded activists possibly as next governor and in the Senate. Two victories tonight. I think that's very significant.
Absolutely.
Neither one of us is part of the political machine. Each of us has met a great deal of resistance from the political establishment, and we will continue to do so. And so I think that's very important for people to understand that if you want real change, this is a way that I see us on the cusp of change, really, potential change with these victories.
And it's time because one of the things, like I was saying, one of the things that kept coming up was education. And I talked to Zakiya Sankara-Jabbar earlier from Racial Justice Now, talking about the school to prison pipeline, and how, in Maryland, these policies have really destroyed, in Baltimore City in particular, really destroyed a lot of children's futures, underfunded schools, but yet, all this funding going into youth detention centers, a whole new youth detention center being built. So I'm excited to see what y'all do because this is, this is what we need.
It's a good time, and it's time. So, let me just say something. When I was in the House of Delegates, I left a year and a half ago, and I left intentionally because I felt that there was nowhere else to go in the House of Delegates. The legislature, and I know a lot of people don't like me saying it, but it's true, is run like a plantation. And as a legislator, you basically are only as good as you follow what the leadership wants you to do. And as soon as you break from that, you no longer have any support to do anything.
Right.
And so it's just a really oppressive system. And people need to understand that. Because if that's the way, if we're good with that, then you don't really need a legislative body. Just have a governor, a Senate president, and a speaker. But why have the rest of us if our only mission is to follow along with whatever they want to do? Our job is to fight for our constituency. And if we represent Baltimore City, then we have a serious mission that is different than other jurisdictions, because our jurisdiction in particular has been met with a lot of discrimination.
That's right.
In many aspects, education and others.
We see from the November 2016 election that you have many more everyday people who are mobilizing and organizing at the grassroots level and trying to connect with legislators like you to say, listen, we know you've kind of been out there and that people have been hiding the ball from us in terms of what it takes for us to create policy, and we want to partner with you. How do you recommend for people to collaborate with you and, bring over West and over East to Annapolis and make sure that Annapolis and our elected officials and our delegation is coming to the people and not just expecting them to come see them,
One of the things that we have to do, and I think we can do, we've done it but not enough, which is bring the legislature to the city more, because it's inconvenient for people to come to Annapolis for 90 days and sit until 10 o'clock at night to have their voice heard. We have to work to change that system where people can actually have hearings and be heard and be considered and weigh in on issues here in Baltimore more, and also make the legislative process more accessible to people. We really need to push back against a leadership that says that our constituents in Baltimore can come down, we can bust people down, and they're going to hear, for example, as we've experienced, from everybody in every law enforcement agency across the state first before they hear from the people who have been aggrieved by some law enforcement officers.
Experiences.
So I think that's our job, to push our way through the resistance in the legislature to actually have the people's voices heard first. So I think those are some of the things we can do. But I also think we have to educate and galvanize our people, and I already see it in the works. It's much more advocacy out here in the streets, not paid advocacy the way it was, only paid advocates and lobbyists, much more than it was when I was in the House of Delegates. So there's already people mobilizing, but we have to educate more. And one of the things I want to just touch on a little bit is that even as great as this victory feels tonight, I still, working early voting in the polls today, I still primarily saw older people voting. There were still very few people that I saw from ages 18 to 30 years old at those polls. And if we do not find a way to inspire them to vote and participate in this process, we lose our whole future.
Absolutely. Well, Senator-elect Jill P. Carter, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've heard from the people in your district. We want to let you get back to your family.
Hey, people in my district, I love you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I promise you will not be sorry.
All right. Jill Carter, we're going to head out, and are we going back to the Jealous rally, I think?
Our state. The Congressman's great wife, Maya Rockeymoore Cummings.
Yes.
For her service and her commitment to building an inclusive economy for all of us. And to Krish Stigmaraja for showing everyone the achievement that a woman who came here as a little girl and a refugee from Sri Lanka can attain in an America that welcomes immigrant children and does not put them in cages. And I want to recognize one more candidate that many of us are carrying in our hearts tonight. County Executive Kevin Cameron. He was a devoted husband, a great father, a great leader. His commitment to the people of Baltimore County and Maryland was awesome. Our prayers continue to be with his wife Jill and their 2 sons.
Yes.
As I've said before, I miss his wit, I miss his wisdom, and I will never forget him. I also want to say thank you to all of you who have contributed so much to this movement.
Yes.
Y'all got to recognize, you might have forgotten, but we started off in 4th and we ended up in 1st.
That's right.
We started from the bottom, now we're here.
Yeah, exactly.
Join me in thanking our campaign staff.
Yes.
Travis, Megan, Kevin, Rich, Erica, Sandy, Tom, April,
Wow, what an evening. I want to thank Jill Carter for joining us. And, you know, we're seeing tonight that apparently progressives can win in Maryland. And we see that with the Jealous race. We see that with the Carter race. We see that in the 45th district. I'm Dr. Khalilah Harris. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed this coverage, we encourage you to go to therealnews.com/donate. We do this for the people. We want to make sure that our news are by the people and of the people. So we'd appreciate any contributions that you can give to the Real News Network so we can keep bringing you events like this here this evening. And join us for the next set of coverage that we do on the election as we wrap up this evening and report out tomorrow on some of the other races that are neck and neck at this time. Have a good night, everybody, and thank you for watching.